Ena mana, ena waka, ena reo, e ra rangatira mā. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Vicky Watson toku ingoa, ko taku mahi ki Aotearoa Circle, ko te Chief Executive. Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. Note we're recording this session for others who have pleaded with us to do that and who can't attend. But we will edit out any sensitive questions if needed. So we'll be operating under Chatham House rules. There are the right people in the room today. I acknowledge the senior leaders, the chief executives, the board chairs and directors, and certainly our Circle Guardians. Bob Punch, Jane Taylor, David Carter, Larissa Cooney, Simon Limmer, and Izzy Bennett. Namahi Arimai, welcome today too. You're here for good reason. The legal opinion released in March sets a new opportunity and challenge for businesses and their board directors to consider nature-related risks in their decision-making, particularly when they depend on nature to deliver the product or service. This has the dual benefit of protecting nature for future generations, as well as ensuring the enduring success of the organisations that you govern. The alarming rate of biodiversity loss and ecosystem breakdown is an emerging global as well as local crisis, one that has the potential to outstrip the impact of the climate crisis. But unlike risk from climate change, understanding of risks to nature and biodiversity systems is at an early stage for most of us here in New Zealand. And this is despite it being a topic picking up a lot of momentum overseas. It appears the main risk to directors is to underestimate the potential impact of nature-related risks. The opportunity is to ensure an enduring business while contributing to national efforts to restore nature. The engagement with this process for many is born from a sense of responsibility to leave New Zealand in a better place. Additionally, talking to some directors, they didn't feel any real threat from a potential legal challenge. They felt the bar would be set too high, but they reflected on the most important thing they felt they owned, their own individual brand. And they agreed that doing this work would enhance that. Today, we're going to take the opinion as read and focus on the how. How does your business, your board of directors, executive team ask the right questions and genuinely consider and mitigate against nature-related risk? I'm joined here by the authors of the legal opinion, Alana Lampert and Nicola Swan, partners at Chapman Tripp, who have been with us, worked with us since 2019 to produce 3 legal opinions now, as well as a director toolkit, all of which are on our website. They'll briefly walk you through the how and key points of this opinion. We'll then hear from Camden Howard from the Sustainability and Climate Change team at PwC. Camden and team and Matt is also on the call, have been managing our new leading partner bootcamp on TNFDs. And I acknowledge our leading partners in the room, Silverfern Farms, Mercury, Ministry for the Environment, Genesis, Fonterra and Zespri. Camden will cover how to assess, how to start assessing material risk, touching on the LEAP process and what trends are emerging internationally. But what's important today is that we also hear from you, questions, comments, requirements, needs to feel more prepared for this. So we've allocated, half the session for that. So how can the Circle help you to do that, or work with others like the Institute of Directors, etc. So Nicola and Alana, over to you. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to share my screen. That comes through loud and clear. Great. So Nicola Swan, I'm a partner in Chapman Tripp in Wellington, and I'm really delighted to be joined by Alana Lampert, who's my partner in Auckland. We have spoken to many of you as we've worked through the process of putting together this opinion and releasing this opinion. And today we are very focused on what is useful as directors in New Zealand start thinking about their obligations under and that are coming out of the opinion, and CEOs start thinking about what they need to do and what more they can do in this area, recognising that it is an area that is new, it's emerging, and it's pretty unknown for many boards and executive teams around the country. And the work that Vicky has been leading in terms of the leading partners, working with the Circle and working with PwC, going through the TNFD bootcamp, which kicked off over the last couple of months, is just fantastic to see. And it's that kind of work which is going to really help build capacity in this area, which is fantastic. So I just wanted to touch briefly on the practical expectations that fall out of the opinion and the sorts of questions that exec teams and boards can start asking to sort of get into this journey, as many of us have experienced on the climate side of the fence, and the amount of work and energy that has gone into upskilling and building capacity on climate-related financial risk identification, assessment and management over the last couple of years has been really incredible. So thinking with that framework in mind, the final summary of the opinion is that prudent directors in specific sectors, and we emphasise that this is going to land for some sectors obviously much more and much earlier than others, with key dependencies on nature or ecosystem services, we're going to touch on that today briefly, should be starting on the path to ensure that their business is in a position to identify dependencies on natural capital, ecosystem services and biodiversity, and we'll look at a couple of examples of that. Move into the critical stage of not just identifying where those dependencies might be, but actually assessing exposure to those risks and the financial materiality of those risks. And this is where we want businesses to be thinking not only what dependencies do we have, but what are the really big ones for us and how could things go badly wrong? And how can we build that into our existing risk management processes and start to just identify, you know, the top 2 or 3 in terms of materiality for our business, that if we don't have those risks wound into our usual risk management processes and have someone responsible for them and have the board asking questions, if that's not happening just because it's a nature risk that has been slightly out of view, then let's pull that into view so that we can make sensible decisions and not be blindsided by something that comes up in a couple of years' time that we might have been able to think about earlier. And of course, that links into the manage those risks that have a financially material impact. Alana, I'm just going to pitch straight to you here to jump into recapping just very shortly a couple of examples of these nature-related risks.
Thanks, Nicola. Yes, so in the opinion, what we were keen to show is how these nature-related risks can be brought to life in particular sectors. We pulled out multiple examples throughout the opinion, but the 4 that we tend to focus on to be able to bring this to life really are on this slide here. So the first being pollination is a key ecosystem service that has been assessed throughout the literature in relation to nature-related risks. And it's certainly the declining bee population and the impact on pollination is one of the examples that is absolutely real for New Zealand businesses, both in, for example, a small to medium enterprise producing manuka honey, but also right through the agricultural system in New Zealand. I mean, some of the estimates are pretty significant, between 300 and 730 million cost to the economy annually as a result of declining bee populations. And in a country such as New Zealand, with their level of exposure to impact on the agricultural system, it's pretty significant. The other example that we brought out, and it's one that's been brought out particularly because of recent weather events as well, is the impact of a loss of wetlands and floodplains on the ability to provide for the ecosystem service of managing flood and erosion and storm protection. We've already seen a considerable regulatory focus or increased regulatory focus on the protection of wetlands. We suspect that that's going to continue through with the Climate Adaptation Act in terms of protection of floodplains and the exclusion of development on floodplain areas. But certainly that loss of wetlands upstream is something that we're seeing a lot more in terms of protection for storm and flooding. What we're also seeing is more of a focus on the impact of degrading soil quality on agricultural yields. And again, we're seeing regulatory moves to protect and constrain development in areas where we have protected or high quality soils. That's through national policy statements under the RMA. And then taking a slightly different example, and this is a lot of the focal point for nature-related risks is certainly in the primary sector, but New Zealand's exposure to the tourism sector as well is another area where there is a risk of nature-related risks having an impact. And a good example of that is the impact that Kauri dieback had on a range of tourism enterprises. So that in 2013, just 2013 alone, the cost to tourism businesses in the Auckland and Northland regions was in the order of 50 million per annum. If you look at other examples, things like Didymo spread that had an order of magnitude larger impact, so something like $300 million impact. So we have a range of examples, and those are just the ones that we pulled out in the opinion. If we flick to the next slide, I think you're in control, Nicola. There is also a range of other ecosystem services. So this is particularly taken from a really useful report produced by PwC back in 2020, which identified the types of ecosystem services on the left-hand side of the slide, and then which sectors were directly and indirectly through their supply chains particularly exposed to risks within those ecosystem services. And what you'll see is that New Zealand has a particular focal point in a number of those sectors which have those direct and indirect risks relating from dependencies on ecosystem services and threats to those ecosystem services. So if we take that background and sort of recognise that that is the background from which New Zealand businesses are looking at these types of risks, it's what we really wanted to do in the opinion was pull out some first steps, some initial questions that directors can ask of their businesses, and to promote the conversation to really get the ball rolling on nature-related risks. And so these questions are deliberately pitched at the initial conversation, really, with exec teams. So the first is a question of board awareness, and Nicola will come on to talk a little bit more about how that board awareness can be assessed and can be promoted within the corporate. But then also looking at expertise. Now that's expertise both from within and externally. But expertise certainly, what we're really keen to show today really is that there are a lot of crossovers from the types of expertise that has already been developed in relation to climate risk, and how that can be utilised and deployed in relation to nature-related risks. Then the next question really is also from the flowchart that Nicola had up earlier, which is assessing those dependencies and risks. So how material are they? How vulnerable is the business to those risks? And how material would the impact of those risks be to the business? We then have a series of questions which relate to the existing risk management processes of the corporate, and how could you consider bringing nature-related risk as part of those existing practices? How can that tie within your climate-related risks? And then the next question, this is a particularly more thorny question, and one which I suspect our friends at PwC will come on to talk to, is the measuring and the anticipation of how that materiality really really can be assessed within the sector and within the particular corporate. And then finally, a useful question, because we can see obviously a lot of focal point, both in the international voluntary side of things through TNFD development, as well as domestic regulatory reforms. So one of the points that we particularly draw out in the opinion is the focus on nature-positive reforms that are coming through at some pace in New Zealand. That's both through the reforms under existing national direction under the Resource Management Act. We've already seen a move towards net gain policies in relation to a range of areas that touch on ecosystem services, as well as incoming reform to replace the RMA, where we've seen the Natural and Built Environments Act, which is still before Select Committee, bring forward those same concepts of net gain. And what they do is create sort of a background in New Zealand where we have much more of a focal point on improvements of nature. And then when that's coupled with the developments of TNFD overseas, it builds that expectation and increasing expectation that corporates will be similarly focused on improvement to nature as opposed to just managing effects within their normal operations. So with that, I'll pass back to Nicola to consider how we take this forward really in terms of actions within a corporate.
Thanks, Alana. So when we shift the focus to CEOs and exec teams who are going to be responding to these initial questions posed by the board, some of the initial work that is already happening in businesses, particularly in the primary sector in New Zealand, there are some really great examples of where these types of risks are already being identified, but perhaps not in the same sort of formulaic way as we've come to understand this process through the climate related financial disclosures process. So what could easily be happening now is that some nature-related risks are already being identified. And so what I think is useful is to say, well, how is that happening? Is that ad hoc? Are they coming up through watching what's happened to a competitor, or watching what's happened overseas, watching to falling yields or crop changes that are occurring in Australia, where you might have heat stress, for example, impacting some aspect of the ecosystem that's impacting business? Is there some issue coming up through social media? Is it some intel coming in from Europe about product labeling or focus from consumers? So how is this coming up? Is it coming up in any sort of systematic way? And are there any blind spots in there, particularly on the regulatory and transition risk side, which could easily be being missed and which actually could pretty easily be identified? So that connects to, is any of this existing, sitting within existing risk management? It could easily be, some of this could be happening, but not happening in a formal way, not being tied into risk appetite statements, risk radars, etc. Is anyone actually responsible for it? It could easily not be a topic that anyone is actually responsible for, and that could be an easy way to just make it clear through the business where some of this focus needs to sit. And do we have the internal capacity? And what I'm really thinking here is on the technical side, and this is where we're really assisted by the PwC work in the boot camp, is what are some of these great resources that you can see through the work of the TNFD globally. If you go onto the TNFD's website, there are just incredible free resources in terms of helping with mapping of some of these issues, but which ones are the easiest ones to use, which ones are freely available, which ones make most sense for which industry. So do we need to get some specialist technical expertise, either internal or external, to just help us grapple with the couple of 2 or 3 maybe main risks for the business? What needs to happen next? So this segues into this risk identification, so sort of more formal understanding of where these key dependencies are, that bringing through the technical expertise. And then it's looking at materiality assessment and prioritisation. So some of these issues, if they're identified, the business may decide, well, that is actually something we've been aware of for some time. We are doing something about it. We can rest assured it's being managed. But there will be others which might need to be elevated up the prioritisation list. And here, I think that the ongoing market scanning and just being aware of the speed and scale of some of these changes, the opinion itself, we deliberately put in there the latest status on everything that's going on around the world in terms of nature-related regulatory reform, market expectations, investor expectations. And so that is an initial resource to make sure that you are across, first of all, the New Zealand regulatory change, but also that TNFD uptake overseas, the really big EU reforms that have already come through on corporate social responsibility that came in, for example, in January, looking at which markets matter most to your business, whether that's domestic or external, overseas, and making sure that you're getting some sort of reporting on what's happening. There's just a couple of examples that we're going to touch on before we close and hand over to Camden. One is there's a really useful report out from UNEP-FI, the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative, which I've put on the screen there, Unboxing Nature-Related Risks. This is changing all the time. The last couple of years, there've been report after report out on this topic, but it's a good one to have a look at. Here, they've got a few examples of different sectors. This was an Asian bank example, and I'm not expecting you to get across the detail of this screen, but it's just a good one to show that on the left they've got some of these key risks. They've got more of the climate ones at the top and then more nature related down the bottom. So for example, down the bottom, movement towards the protection of marine ecosystems, or progress in nature related risk disclosure, which we've been talking about. And then they're mapping it right through to the right in terms of the actual impact, whether it's a credit risk, whether it's helping to prevent credit risk, whether it's reputational. And so you can see that these go in different directions. And there's clearly one of the opportunities here, which the bank is mapping as prevention of credit risk, which is improved risk management of portfolios related to this progress in nature-related risk disclosure. So a simpler version of this, but something to kind of work out where is this going to be positive for a business and where is it going to be negative is an initial thing to be doing. Another way of looking at it that I thought was particularly useful, this is an example from a European vineyard. So here they've mapped risks. The two boxes are short-term and long-term, and I've just circled on the right in terms of the sort of longer-term, most impactful risks, i.e. those that are higher in likelihood and higher in magnitude. You can see for this one, you've got the obvious physical risks in terms of grape production, quality, coming through. But then you have one of the key transition risks they've identified is this changes in the legal operational context due to new legislation, regs and policies. But then a really big opportunity, which they've actually mapped as being at the same sort of magnitude likelihood level, which is a resource efficiency benefit. And just one example there, before I hand back to Alana briefly, is one of the examples called out, which has a sort of a more local resonance, was a particular vineyard in Australia, in Tasmania, that had actually reduced the area it needed to spray with pesticides by 80% because of planting of corridors of native vegetation, which was helping reduce the need for pesticides because of the ecosystem benefits. So, you know, there's a few sort of golden examples like that if we can connect into early, we've got the benefit of being able to use those and bring them into sort of empowering the New Zealand business community to be thinking about this rather than having the negative impact of some of these effects down the track. Hopefully we can see this as trying to see some of these opportunities. So Alana, back to you to close, and then we're over to Camden.
Thanks, Nicola. What we thought would be useful next point really to make sure that one of the first questions to really ask within the deployment of nature-related risk considerations is broad awareness and understanding. So the key question is delivering on the why. So when you're starting conversations about a new area or a new way of collating risk, the key thing is really to be clear as to why those risks matter for the business. And developing the why is not just a matter of considering the risk, but also the opportunity. And so we suggest that as the first starting point, really to discuss the merits of doing so and the need and the urgency of doing so. The next kind of key question really is to look at this as part of a wider strategy. There have been a huge number of skills built within organizations already in relation to climate risk, and the utilization of those skills to cover nature-related risks also is a key efficiency that most organizations who are down the train on climate-related disclosures are able to utilize. And seeing this under that wider ESG and sustainability lens as part of a development of a broader strategy in terms of risk management and opportunity identification is a really useful way of ensuring that you integrate nature-related risk as part of your existing work programs. And there are absolutely links within that. The other point to recognise is really to see what tools and what resources are already out there. Now, there really are a huge number of resources already out there. We'll come on to the next slide to talk about some of them, but we are seeing a development within government as well of increased reporting. So you'll see a reference throughout the opinion, an increased focus on the New Zealand biodiversity reporting by the government. And as we come through into increased Resource Management Act reforms, we will have a much greater focus on councils undertaking additional reporting of ecosystem services and impacts on ecosystem services. So looking to pull those resources from the government side is pretty critical. There are also a number of resources from the corporate side. So looking, TNFD beta version 4.1 has produced a lot of guidance and a lot of support documentation to enable you to go into the first pilots of TNFD considerations and nature-related risks. We've also referenced on here natural capital protocol, but the report that Nicola was referring to before as well, into the United Nations Environment Programme for the financial initiative also is really useful. It's a document which took a great deal of organisations through a pilot program on the initial development of or deployment of nature-related risks within their own organisations. And there's some really useful ways that each organisation has seen how nature-related risks can be assessed within different sectors. And then also we'd suggest not forgetting the huge number of climate-related disclosure toolkits and resources that are available. And the Chapter Zero climate toolkit is one of those that can very easily be picked up and applied in the context of nature-related risks as well. So with that, I think we will hand over to Camden at PwC and then be available for questions at the end.
Fantastic, thank you. Can someone give me a thumbs up if you can see that screen? Fantastic. O tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, ko Camden Howard tōku ingoa. Thanks, Vicky, and thank you, Nicola and Lana, for that. Thanks, everyone, for your interest this morning as well. So I'm here to talk about nature, how it relates to your business, and how the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures can support you to take action now. So let's crack into it. First, I thought it'd be useful to define what we mean by nature, particularly in an Aotearoa context. I think often we think of nature as the natural environments, the flora and the fauna around us, and it is this, but it's also all of the living organisms around us and all of the ecological systems and processes that interact with us on a day-to-day basis. And finally, it's also us. You know, we are nature. So cultural and societal dimensions to our understanding nature are also critical. And when it comes down to businesses, you know, our economies are embedded, just like people are, within nature, not external to it. So for businesses, nature can be many things. It can represent land, water, resource use, can be impacted by waste, plastics, pollution. And nature is, of course, intrinsically linked to the delivery of climate and societal goals. And on top of that, to the very fabric of how we live our lives as humans. So with that comes a lot of risk and opportunity when we see nature loss. And just last week, PwC's global network launched our Centre for Nature Positive Business. And as part of that, we released our report, Managing Nature Risks from Understanding to Action. And this built on the work that Alana just mentioned that we did with the World Economic Forum back in 2020, which found that $44 trillion worth of global GDP was highly or moderately dependent on nature. And this update, which is, you know, only 3 years later, shows that figure has risen to 58 trillion, or over 55% of global GDP, obviously significant. And many of you here in the room will be working in sectors that are highly dependent on nature, agriculture, forestry, our seafood industry, food and beverage, and then of course the construction sector. So in an Aotearoa context, given we are so highly reliant on those highly dependent industries, we're seeing it's around 70% of our entire export earnings are entirely dependent on nature for their operations. So, this importance has been one of the key drivers for the development of various different disclosure frameworks and standards, both here and globally. You will have seen the Global Biodiversity Framework deal that was signed at COP15, December last year at the UN Biodiversity Conference. So that listed over 27 nature-related goals, perhaps most notably the 30 by 30 commitment to preserve 30% of the planet's land and seas. We have the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which includes reporting on both nature and biodiversity, among other things. The Science Based Targets Network, which is relevant particularly for setting metrics and targets around nature, and is very much integrated with the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD, which I'll speak to more. So the ultimate aim for the TNFD is to support a shift in global financial flows away from nature negative outcomes towards nature positive outcomes. Obviously a fairly lofty goal, but a great place to start. And it really is similar to the TCFD, a risk management and disclosure framework. And it actually takes a lot of its structure, inspiration and approach from the TCFD. Uses the same or very similar 4 pillars that the TCFD was structured around: governance, strategy, risk management. It also adds impact into that, and metrics and targets. And you'll be aware of the TCFD's influence on the XRB's recently released Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards, which has become mandatory for quite a number of large organisations here in Aotearoa. The TNFD is a market-led initiative. PwC, our Canadian firm, is part of that development process. They lead the data and analytics work stream within that. And we're currently on, as Alana mentioned, version 0.4, which is the final beta testing phase for the framework. And we're expecting to see the version 1.0 released to the public in September 2023. Because of the inherent complexity and need for building of capacity and capability within organisations of this nature-related reporting protocol, the TNFD has put out an indicative 5-year timeline of an expectation for organisations to build that up from a initially lowly scoped or scoped back assessment up to a full assessment and disclosure. So that gives you an idea of the timeframes you might be looking at in your business to start building that capacity. So I'm not going to go through the full framework today. There's sort of thousands of pages of reading, and we'd need several weeks to go through all of that. So I wanted to touch just briefly on a valuable tool that TNFD offers. So just in terms of context, the wider TNFD framework, as you will have seen with the TNFD, the TCFD has a wider disclosure framework and set of recommendations. I believe there are 14 recommendations. The TCFD had 11 disclosure recommendations. So it has core concepts and definitions to help with standardization of reporting and of understanding, and additional guidance. So, for example, sector-specific report. But finally, and most importantly, in this context, it has a really useful process for risk assessment, which is called LEAP. And so regardless of whether or not your organisation at this stage in a voluntary capacity intends to make nature-related disclosures, LEAP is a critical internal process for understanding nature and how it relates to your business. And so within TNFD's recommendations, LEAP is voluntary guidance. It's not a mandated process even within that framework. And not everything that's identified is recommended to be disclosed, but it is a critical internal assessment process to allow you to understand those nature-related impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. And I have seen versions of LEAP, which is marked as sleep. I don't think it was as sexy an acronym, so they removed that. But the S stands for scoping, which is at the initial phase, scoping your assessment to match the capability and capacity that your organisation has to gather this information and pull this together. The L is locate, that's understanding your organisation's interface with nature. The E is evaluate, so considering the dependencies and impacts on nature. And then the A is assess, so that's understanding the material risks and opportunities to your business from those. Finally, P is prepare, and that is really not just around reporting, but it's around responding to those risks and opportunities that you've identified. So just to jump into one really tangible example, I wanted to walk through what the locate phase looks like. I'm focusing on this because regardless of whether you're engaged in the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures or even within the full LEAP approach, the locating your interface with nature piece is a critical first step. And I suppose the spoiler alert on this is that nature is everywhere. So all parts of your business will interface with nature. This assessment really is about prioritizing those interfaces with nature. And so the LEAP approach asks 4 key questions of businesses. Firstly, on your business footprint, where are your direct assets and operations? And you might see those in a climate context as scope 1 and 2. And then your related value chain, so your upstream and downstream activities, which is in some cases that I've seen been referred to as sort of scope 3 for nature. Secondly, your nature interface. So which biomes and ecosystems do your activities interface with? And what is the integrity and importance, both now and in the future, of those ecosystems? And so you can see in both of these questions on the visuals that we have there, the very specific location and the polygons of the locations of your activities and assets is a critical step in identifying this interconnectedness of those activities and nature. The next step is around prioritization. So at what locations is your organization interfacing with ecosystems that are low integrity, high biodiversity importance, or perhaps under water stress? And there are a number of tools available both in New Zealand and globally to help with those assessments, both digital tools around data and knowledge gathering. And finally, sector identification. So what sectors, business units or asset classes are interfacing with nature in these locations? So the point of that piece is to allow businesses to segment those prioritized locations by the various ways that they may already manage risks in the different sectors, units and geographies. So I think the point there being that this is intended to be incorporated into existing organizational risk management frameworks. And as Vicky and Alana alluded to, we are currently working with a number of those leading partners for the Aotearoa Circle, and many of you are on this call, so kia ora koutou, and working with them on a workshop series which takes us through the LEAP approach. And the intention of that is really to support how we apply TNFD in an Aotearoa context. It's a collaborative process, and we're really putting Te Ao Māori worldviews front and centre there to try to understand how we apply global frameworks specifically to an Aotearoa New Zealand context. And it's an iterative and collaborative process. The TNFD framework is still in development, and we're working through this with participants over the next 4 or 5 months. And in fact, I think our next workshop is tomorrow. So I look forward to seeing those of you on the call who are there bright and early tomorrow morning. And finally, I just wanted to end on a few what we're calling no regrets actions that all businesses can start and should start with. So firstly, as I mentioned, that understanding of your interface with nature. So use the LEAP approach. It's there. It's publicly available on the TNFD website. There's a lot of resources around it. If you do need help, come and talk to us. We're working through this and have some experience in our first iteration of this with our workshop series now. Develop a nature positive strategy. So mitigate those risks you've identified and create value by gearing your strategy for nature positive opportunities. And then finally, get ready for disclosures and regulation. Sort of as we saw with the TCFD, the XRB took those recommendations and built them into the Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards over a number of years. We don't know where that's going to go, but prudent businesses would get ready for that. So identify those data needs and gaps and integrate nature positive strategy into your reporting. There's a link there to pwc.com/nature where you can see a bunch more on this. I want to thank you for your time. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou.
Thanks, Camden. Thanks, Nicola and Alana. We're also going to invite Matt from PwC also into the questions, and Jess will no doubt pin you all so that everyone can see you. We've had a comment through the chat from Don Alder in terms of the most likely risk for most of New Zealand is probably geological earthquakes, etc. No question, maybe it's just an observation from Don's point of view to kind of put it out there. If there are any questions, please raise your hand, and I'm hoping that I will be able to see you. Thanks for the great examples. It's always really helpful, I think, to sort of have the various industries illustrated as to what kind of risks we need to consider. I do have a question if no one is forthcoming in the next couple of seconds. It's probably a question, maybe Alana. We've talked a lot about physical risks. So what are some of the regulatory transition risks that are starting to come through for New Zealand?
Well, we're in that interesting stage where we're before the election hiatus. So there is more regulation than than we've had coming at us for quite some time. So we're in the middle of RMA reform, obviously. So one of the key outcomes of that reform is going to be subject to, of course, Select Committee reporting and passing the legislation before the election, is going to be the development of a huge number of additional plans within New Zealand. And one of the focal points of that legislation is to develop a series of environmental bottom lines. And those bottom lines are sort of inalienable limitations on constraints on the natural environment. So we've already seen some of those forms of environmental bottom lines come through in the nature of water quality limits. So expectations of levels of water quality in water systems have come through under the existing RMA National Policy Statement in relation to freshwater management. We're going to see a lot more of that vein of development, where we have specific environmental limits. And then within those limits, there will be expectations not only of businesses to mitigate their effects, but also to contribute to some sort of positive movement towards the direction of travel that's expected to reach environmental targets as well. So not only do we have bottom lines for limits, but we will also have expectations for targets coming through in the legislation. And that represents quite a significant change for the way that we've managed effects of businesses on the environment in New Zealand, which to date has been more in the vein of mitigating effects or minimising effects. So that change is really significant. Now that change is not just an overnight change. We're looking at sort of a 10-year process for those plans to come through once the legislation comes through. And that is all, of course, pending what happens in the general election. But leaving aside those really significant national level legislative changes, we also have a number of specific areas of interest where we have change. So, for example, if you're looking from the climate space, we have greater focus coming through just in the most recent Climate Change Commission report on what's going on in the waste sector. We see the crossovers between climate and nature-related risks coming through in the emissions reduction plan workshops that are being undertaken currently. And when we get next emissions reduction plan coming through next year, I think you'll absolutely see that there is a crossover between nature-related risks and climate risk coming through, and seeing the dependencies of both and the opportunities of both coming through in national direction.
Thanks, Alana. Kind of scary that I saw yet again, and I've seen it before, but it just always hits me how 55% of GDP in the world is reliant on nature, but in Aotearoa, 70%, which is exactly the reason the Aotearoa Circle started, that sustainable prosperity as our bigger vision, but the restoring of natural capital, the future generations, are absolutely key to get us going. I'm wondering, and Nicola, this might be from your perspective because it speaks a little bit to litigation. The conversation so far with some directors talking about that the chance of litigation, the bar will be so high, not really so worried about that, but more thinking about their reputation risk and their own individual brand. Some of the directors are saying, look, at most I might be 3 years, I might be 6 years on those boards. You know, this will be seen as the right thing to do, but necessarily not too worried about litigation. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. And as a litigator, I think that's an excellent strategy, that you do not want to be driven by the litigation risk on this. And we've been really mindful through doing a legal opinion process here that you don't want to be driven by litigation risk. And I think David, and David just put forward a comment, this reminded me of David's comment when the opinion was being launched, that if you're being driven by litigation risk, you're not going to get the positive change within the business, and you're not going to maximize the opportunities in this because you're going to be looking at it from that compliance risk aversion lens. And we've seen that over and again in the climate space, that the businesses that are doing the best out of this are looking at where are our opportunities, how can we align with our key stakeholders, how can we get ahead of what's happening in our markets, rather than being worried about where litigation might go in 10 years' time. And as a litigator, if you're the kind of business that has taken that really sort of front forward, lean in, positive approach in terms of getting across this early, you are going to be in a much better position to defend any sort of litigation that comes up against you than if you've purely looked at this from a litigation risk aversion perspective, which does tend to close down the discussion. I've certainly observed that in some of the board discussions we've had around climate over the last couple of years. So 3 areas where I think it's worth really asking the question whether or not this is coming up is new product development, new investment decisions, big allocation of capital. Are we thinking about some of these areas where development might be much more difficult because of the regulatory RM changes that are coming through? And R&D investment, are we thinking about what could actually give us real benefit, particularly thinking about how our markets are going to be responding to this issue in a couple of years? Are we factoring any of this into the R&D consideration work streams within businesses? So new products, new investments, capital allocation, and R&D are probably areas where this might not be coming up in a very structured way, and this is an opportunity to just ask some of those questions.
Nice. I was at the XRB summit yesterday. They're hosting 7 or 8 countries around the Asia Pacific to essentially swap notes on standard setting and to learn from New Zealand and how it did that. And one of the comments that consistently came through from the other countries that were there was this balance between not letting perfection get in the way of progress. And Matt and Cam, I just sort of wonder, talking to, again, a few of the directors and CEOs and sort of almost pulling their hair out going, we're so overwhelmed trying to get our head around TCFD, how on earth can we take this on? But just perhaps, and the 5-year timeline that's coming through, perhaps sort of suggests this as well, is that this is not a need to get it perfect straight away. Is that what you're feeling? Is that at least starting?
Yeah, that was one of the guiding principles we have through the workshop series, really, is not letting perfect get in the way of the good. And I mentioned the SLEEP acronym, so that scoping phase being absolutely critical for businesses straight up to have a look at where they see that internal capability and capacity, what they see as a starting point for this, because getting started in this, it identifies the gaps and the challenges whether it be from a process perspective, a risk management perspective, a data perspective, a stakeholder perspective. It helps to identify those so that at the next iteration, you've got more information at hand, you've got more of those systems refined, and it is an iterative process. So I think starting at an achievable and manageable scoping for this, particularly if you're going through the LEAP process, is the absolute recommendation, because it is necessarily orders of magnitude more complex, this understanding, than even the climate related risk reporting. Matt, did you want to add anything to that?
I guess the only point I would probably add to that is the point around data. I think it's so difficult with nature, because where we currently sit with regards to nature is a position of immaturity, particularly relative to the climate space. And when you think that nature risk manifests itself at a kind of highly location specific level, when you think of the kind of infinite complexity of organizations' value chains, and the need to get data from suppliers, from customers, and across the value chain, kind of understanding the data that you need to get and the format and how you're going to use it is really, really important to kind of get you on that, I guess, curve of maturity, so that within the next 5 years, you can be in a position where you're able to use that data and be able to map your risks and opportunities across your value chain.
Building on that question of data as well, there's also a lot of data that a number of organizations, particularly in the highly exposed sectors, already have within their organizations. It's about marshalling that data. So you already have a large number of the primary sector businesses who will have compliance and increasing compliance obligations under environmental laws to record and monitor their impact. And as that information is collated more increasingly from councils and are produced into national level reports, we'll have a developing level of data that can be utilised in nature-based reporting. And that's quite consistent with the experience that we've already had in relation to climate, where there has been a recognition of what data is already available, the collation of that data, and the improvement of that data. And one of the experiences that I think we can draw on quite happily from climate also is to see that those who were early movers are now really well positioned in the climate space to be able to be undertaking CID. And so you have some of those early movers who have, for example, undertaken analyses of what their opportunities for reductions might be on something like a material or marginal abatement cost curve, and really worked out what of their actions are at no cost to the organisation as well, or in fact maybe at a benefit to the organisation. And so it's about making sure that you've got sufficient data to be able to work out what your actions could be that actually have no material cost, but have a benefit from a nature-related risks management and reporting, and therefore reputation perspective.
Thanks. Carry on.
Oh, just jumping onto that and picking up Ben's question on the chat. I think a helpful way of thinking of, CEO providing guidance and lasting, value from your time, your question earlier, Vicky. Maturity is a really useful way of thinking about this, and starting on the path now and sort of a low maturity space and doing the basics, and then anticipating that maturity within your own organization is going to grow over the next 5 years is such a nice way of developing this, because that keeps expectations, manageable in the current pretty tight operating environment, but does allow you to tell a story to your stakeholders, whether that's your investors or future financing coming in, or markets, whatever it might be, that you have started on the journey and that you are developing the maturity of assessment and capability within the business. And that will then, as Rob rightly says, do you think that over time TCFD and TNFD will be subsumed into integrated reporting? Absolutely, that's the direction we're heading. That's the direction. If you want a guide as to where we're going, then just look at the EU Corporate Sustainability Directive that is now in force for a large number of EU businesses and their supply chains as of January. It's not something that's coming. It is now in force, and that is very much down the track of integrated reporting. And you can even see in New Zealand, XRB already have a mandate to look towards integrated reporting, and you can see that on their website at the moment. It's already a program of work there. They're just slowly starting to work towards.
And linked with that, I guess it was, as Camden spoke to in his presentation, with the disclosure recommendations of the TNFD, it was very deliberate that they were built out very much in the style of TCFD. I guess the idea there is not to make life harder, it's to try and think about synergies where nature and climate interact with each other. And that is something that is explicitly kind of noted within the recommendations and broader guidance of the TNFD as well.
Thanks, Matt. And just picking up on the data question, I mean, one of the hopes I have, the objectives for the TNFD boot camp that we're running is that as we progress, not only will we be able to ascertain what data we have, if it's in the right format or what it might need to be done, but with MFE and DOC, and also bringing in some of the other partners like Stats NZ and some of the LINs and local councils is where the data gaps are, and what we might be able to identify to also help government start to work on that bigger picture as well. Izzy, totally agree. Nature TNFDs are less mature for organisations and therefore will take time to implement, but for broader stakeholders, it will take significantly less time for them to lift their expectations on organisations in this space. So again, market driven, hopefully that will, well, no doubt that will pick up and put a lot more pressure on organisations. So as you say, those early movers will probably see that benefit even more. I'm aware at 8:57, everyone has no doubt got a 9 o'clock pushing on their diary. Thank you to Nicola, again, been involved since 2019 with the Circle, the third legal opinion you've put out. Thanks, Alana, for joining that partnership now and helping us with that. And Camden and Matt from PwC, who I'm really enjoying in the boot camp as well. Thank you to everyone who's turned up this morning. It's a fantastic turnout, and hopefully many of you will, this will be your first experience of the Aotearoa Circle from a board perspective, but please do get in touch if there's something else that we can do to help you on this journey, to help with in terms of the legal opinion, particularly in nature-related risks and opportunities. So thank you, have a wonderful day, and appreciate you coming in this morning. Cheers.